Good morning. It is Monday, May the 23rd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have No Free Lunch, Fossil Fuels Chapter 2, and Hondo Chapter 7. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, Biblical Principles to Defeat the Devil for May 23rd. Ask, and it will be given unto you. Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. For every one that asketh receiveth. He that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. Or what man is there of you, whom, if his son ask bread, will he give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a serpent? If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts unto your children, know how much more shall your Father, which is in heaven, give good things to them that ask him? If two of you agree on earth concerning anything that you ask, it will be done for you from my throne in heaven. Matthew 7:7. Prayer declaration. Father, I will give to your work, and it will be given to me. Good measure, passed down, shaken together, and running over. For with the same measure that I use, it will be measured back to me. If I abide in you, and your words abide in me, I will ask what I desire, and it shall be done for me. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for Biblical Principles to Defeat the Devil for May 23rd. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded and asks why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservative political priorities? Number one, a constitutional amendment banning abortion throughout the country. Number two, make nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons obsolete. Number three, the immediate decertification of all public employee unions. Number four, the immediate assignment of criminal and civil liability to all government regulators. Number five, the immediate repeal of the so-called Patriot Act. Number six, the immediate repeal of all dictator laws. Number seven, the reinstatement of writs of outlawry. Number eight, government-sponsored recalls, ballot initiatives, and referendums. Number nine, a flexible minimum wage. Number 10, means-tested health care. And number 11, the immediate and permanent prohibition of investment banking by any office holder. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. 250 economic truths. Quote, again, the main issue is not control-seeking bosses versus freedom-seeking workers. Very often, the person most likely to restrict the workplace freedom of one worker is another worker. Unquote. Tyler Cowen. Indeed, the saddest examples of crony capitalism today come from those on an even playing field, seeking to use leverage, power, and the authority of a disinterested third party to advantage themselves by restricting someone else. Those who resist right-to-work laws are case in point. Cronyism is wrong when it comes from the C-suite, and it is wrong when it comes with the cause of the labor attached to it. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you. And now the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. We finished chapter 1 yesterday, in which the author was basically laying out his case. It was more like an introduction. But anyhow, this is chapter 2, The Energy Challenge. Cheap, plentiful energy, reliable energy for 7 billion people. Tell me if this is motivating. This year, humanity will use some 560 quadrillion BTUs of energy, which averages out to around 215,000 BTUs per person per day. And some people have access to less than 25,000 BTUs per day. No? Unfortunately, discussions of energy are often extremely abstract and technical, causing us not to think about energy in a very personal, meaningful way. Before I studied energy professionally, I thought of it mostly when I filled up my car, when I paid my power bill, and when I followed controversies about allegedly bad things the energy industry, usually the fossil fuel industry, was doing. But the reality is that energy affects nearly every aspect of life. Almost nothing matters more to our lives, the lives of those who care about, and the lives of billions of others around the world than the existence of cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. To give you a sense of what I mean, here's a story from the Gambia about what electricity means to a woman having a child. At 4 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, I was startled when the lights came on. The lights never came on after 2 p.m. on the weekends. The adrenaline really kicked in when I was invited to observe an emergency cesarean section, a first for me. When the infant emerged, I felt my heart racing from excitement and awe. But no matter how many times the technician suctioned out the nose and mouth, the infant did not utter a sound. After 25 minutes, the technician and nurse both gave up. The surgeon later explained that the baby had suffocated in utero. If only they had enough power to use the ultrasound machine for each pregnancy, he would have detected the problem earlier and been able to plan the C-section. Without early detection, the C-section became an emergency. Moreover, the surgery had to wait for the generator to be powered on. The loss of precious minutes meant the loss of a precious life. At that time, in that place, all I could do was cry. And later, when the maternity ward was too hushed, I cried again. A full-term infant was born weighing only 3.5 pounds. In the U.S., the solution would have been obvious and effective incubation, but without reliable electricity, the hospital did not even contemplate owning an incubator. The seemingly simple solution was not available to this newborn girl, and she perished needlessly. Reliable electricity is at the forefront of every staff member's thoughts. With it, they can conduct tests with electrically powered medical equipment, use vaccines and antibiotics requiring refrigeration, and plan surgeries to meet patients' needs. Without it, they will continue to give their patients the best care available. But in a country with an average life expectancy of only 54 years, it's a hard fight to win. This story should remind us of how unnatural our lives are and why it's a good thing. It's easy to take for granted that we have the ability to detect early problems with babies, not thinking that absent the machine that can detect them and the energy to power that machine, human beings past and present have lost untold millions of babies. It's easy to take for granted that we have the ability to keep a 3.5-pound baby alive, not thinking that absent the machine that can incubate it and the energy to power that machine, most of people's beloved children who are underweight babies would have died. This is a microcosm of the central idea of this book, that more energy means more ability to improve lives. Less energy means less ability, more helplessness, more suffering, and more death. Of course, this book is focused on fossil fuel energy, but only, as you'll see, because I believe that it is the most essential technology for producing energy for 7 billion people to improve their lives, at least over the next several decades. If there was a better form of energy and it was under attack in a way that wildly exaggerated its negatives and undervalued its positives, I'd be writing the moral case for that form of energy. There are two facts about energy that are missing from our discussion. One, people around the world need much, much more energy. And two, it's extremely difficult to produce energy cheaply and reliably. Machine calories. Humanity needs as much energy as it can get. First, what exactly is energy? The technical definition is the capacity to do work. But my favorite way to sum it up is with two words: machine calories. Every human being runs off the calories he or she consumes. Those calories are our energy, our ability to act. If we run out of calories, we can't act. We die. The same is true of the machines we use to improve our lives, whether we're talking about the ultrasound and incubation machines that enable us to save babies, the computers that enable us to gain or discover knowledge, the planes that enable us to visit family members across the globe, or the factories that make it possible for all of those things to be affordable. Every aspect of our lives is improved dramatically by machines. Those machines live on energy, their ability to act. And without energy, they are the same as the energy-starved machines that can't save the Gambian babies. Useless. And we desperately need machines to do work for us because we are naturally very weak. Without machines to help us, we don't have anywhere near all the energy that we need to survive and flourish. The average human being needs about 2,000 calories a day to give him enough energy to do everything he needs to do. From going to the office to taking a walk to manual labor to sleeping, that's equal to 2,326 watt hours, which is the amount of energy it takes to power a 100-watt light bulb for 23.26 hours. Essentially, your body uses the same amount of energy as a 100-watt light bulb. Pretty interesting, right? The more physical work you need to do, the more calories you use. A farmer doing vigorous physical work for a day might exert 4,000 calories. An Olympic athlete like Michael Phelps might use 8,000 calories of energy a day. The more energy you are using at any time, the more power you are exerting. Power is defined as the rate of energy use. Power is energy in action. The gasoline is the energy, the engine turns it into power. And here's where the problem of human weakness comes in. We are not very powerful. About 1/10 as powerful as a horse, and that's 1/200th the power of the average car. And thus we can use only so much energy and do only so much work, not nearly enough for a good standard of living. The story of energy for over 99% of history is that human beings couldn't get enough of it to live, and if they could make very limited use of it because they lacked power. Thus, they spent their lives engaging in grueling physical labor just to keep their bodies going long enough to engage in the next day of grueling physical labor. Now, if we're all like Superman, it would be a different story. Imagine if Superman, instead of devoting himself to saving Lois Lane and others, decided to help poor countries industrialize. He would be amazing. Superman's superpower, after all, is power. He's a high-powered machine that stores a lot of energy in his body. He can melt iron, forge steel, plow fields, build buildings, even run an electrical system by turning some sort of especially large crank. He could transform any place for the better. And so can we. With enough energy and high-powered machines, using human ingenuity, we have made ourselves into Superman. Consider the amount of energy at the average American's disposal. The average American's total machine energy use is 186,000 calories a day, 93 humans or 23 Michael Phelpses. This is one of the greatest achievements in human history. In the past, before modern energy technology, the main way to overcome the problem of human weakness was putting others into a state of servitude or slavery, which meant that only some could prosper and at the great expense of others. But with machine energy and machine servants, no one has to suffer. In fact, the more people, the merrier. The most memorable summary I've read about this amazing development is by economist Milton Friedman. Industrial progress, mechanical improvement, all of the great wonders of the modern era have meant little to the wealthy. The rich in ancient Greece would have benefited hardly at all from modern plumbing. Running servants replaced running water. Television and radio. The patricians of Rome could enjoy the leading musicians and actors in their home, could have the leading artists as domestic retainers. Ready-to-wear clothing, supermarkets, all these and many other modern developments would have added little to their life. They would have welcomed the improvements in transportation and in medicine, but for the rest, the great achievements of Western capitalism have redounded primarily to the benefit of the ordinary person. These achievements have made available to the masses conveniences and amenities that were previously the exclusive prerogative of the rich and powerful. Running servants replaced running water. I'll never forget that. The energy challenge: cheap, plentiful, reliable, scalable. If our ability to act to improve our lives depends on energy, we have an epic challenge. There's 7 billion people in the world, but 1.3 billion have no electricity. Over 3 billion are classified as not having adequate electricity, a threshold that is far less than we enjoy and take for granted. For everyone to have as much access to energy as the average American, the world's energy production would have to quadruple, and we Americans would benefit greatly from even more cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. So where are we going to get it from? In this chapter and the next, we're going to examine every major energy technology, including all the non-fossil fuel sources of energy, to get an idea of how much they can contribute to energy production going forward. This is important because, assuming you can do it safely, the more energy production, the better, and also because there are concerns about the future supply of fossil fuels and the present and future risks of fossil fuels. We'll cover future supply in the next chapter and in Chapter 8, and the risks in Chapter 4 through 6. But as a matter of principle, anytime we are worried about the risks of one way of doing things, here using fossil fuel energy, we need to know the benefits and risks of the alternatives. 19th century coal technology is justifiably illegal today. The hazardous smoke that would be generated is now preventable by far more advanced, cleaner coal-burning technologies. But in the 1800s, it was and should have been perfectly legal to burn coal this way, because the alternative was death by cold or starvation or wretched poverty. By the same token, the degree of risk we would theoretically be willing to accept from fossil fuels will depend in large part on what the alternatives are. Let's say, and I'm completely making this up, we could prove that burning fossil fuels will cause 10 times more hurricanes for the next 50 years. Should the government take action? Well, if there's a technology that is more affordable and can scale to produce cheaper, more plentiful, reliable energy for 7 billion people, then quite possibly. But if there's no equal or superior alternative, then any government action against fossil fuels, let alone the 50 to 95% bans over the next several decades that have been proposed, is a guaranteed early death sentence for billions. We would be willing to accept 10 times more hurricanes if we had to. Energy is that important. To get a sense of where things stand today and where they stood in the past, when renewables were predicted to be the future, let's look at how much energy use comes from what sources? Solar and wind produce a combined 1% of the energy we use, whereas fossil fuel energy, coal, oil, and natural gas, produces 86%, more than 5 times all others combined. That 86% is only 7% less than the 1980s 93%, but the total is what matters most. Note that our total fossil fuel use is now far, far greater. Other sources of energy, particularly nuclear and hydro, have been supplements, not replacements, for fossil fuels. And note that in many ways people have been discouraged from using fossil fuels. For the last 30 years, governments around the world, particularly European governments like Germany, Spain, and Denmark, have gone out of their way to promote non-fossil fuel forms of energy, such as solar, wind, and biofuels. Nevertheless, fossil fuels have remained the energy source of choice. Why? Or to put it in reverse, why is so much energy not made from alternatives? And that's the end of part 1 of chapter 2 from the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now Hondo by Louis L'Amour, and this is going to be chapter 8. Chapter 7, the way we left it is that Hondo had made it into the camp, the army camp, and had reported to the major in charge and running things that Company C had been obliterated. He had run into, without knowing it, Ed Lowe, who was Mrs. Lowe's husband, when Ed Lowe was looking to kick the dog. And so Hondo drew a gun on him. And anyhow, so it turns out Ed Lowe is a cranky kind of guy. And but anyway, so Hondo is now in camp. He's going to get to some sleep, and who knows what's next for Hondo. But in this chapter, he's going to end up meeting Ed Lowe. Somebody's going to tell him who he is, and he's going to end up getting into a fight with Ed Lowe. So, chapter 8. It was after 10 when Hondo awakened. Accustomed sleeping in short snatches when and where it was possible, his body could not attune itself to long, unrestricted rest. To oversleep was dangerous, and despite his weariness, he awakened suddenly and with a start. He stared up into the dark, not moving, until his mind knew where he was, and the countless tiny sounds began to sort and adjust themselves. Slowly his muscles relaxed. He was at the post. Groggily, he sat up and ran his fingers through his hair. His body felt heavy, and his mouth tasted bad. He swore, walked to the bucket on the table, and lifted it to drink. Then he spat into the street. It was very dark, but there were stars. A coolness left by the rain still pervaded the desert night. He bathed his face, combed his hair, and then picked up his hat. From up the company street he heard the sound of an out-of-tune piano, and with it a clear Irish tenor singing "Brennan on the Moor," an old Irish folk song of a highwayman and his love. Hondo Lane stepped out into the night and looked around, sensing the darkness, taking his feel of it before moving on. Far out over the hills, a coyote yapped his loneliness to the listening stars. A faint breeze stirred the tent flaps. A tent not far away showed the dull glow of a lamp, and he heard a murmur of voices and a slap of cards. Hondo Lane walked up the street toward the sutler's store, his boots grating on the gravel and clay of the parade ground. 2 men sat outside the store smoking. One of them murmured a greeting, and Hondo replied with a short "howdy," not knowing the man. Inside, the room was crowded. It was a long and dingy room without color, without light, without women. Several men leaned against the homemade bar at one end, and at the other there was a counter where the trade goods were dispensed, with shelves behind it. The Irish tenor leaned on the battered upright piano, wearing a rumpled but once fashionable gray suit and a derby hat with a dent and a badly scuffed brim. He was a young man with a dashing mustache, and he needed a shave. The man at the piano was a cowhand, bearing out the fact that in the melting pot of the West there was no estimating the hidden talents of a drifting man. All were roughly dressed but the soldiers. A few were still around, although most had turned in by now. The men of the crowd were cowhands, cattlemen, gamblers, prospectors, drifters, and scouts. There was a tension in the group, and nobody was talking of what they were all thinking. In the morning, a burial party would go out to inter the bodies of Company C, a party that must in itself be strong. Not a man here but might be called upon to go, and not a man here who had not lost a friend or drinking companion in the massacre of Company C. Hondo walked to the bar, and the sutler reached underneath for a bottle of Irish whiskey. He winked at Hondo, filled his glass, and said quietly, "On the house." Then the bottle vanished again, unseen by the habitués of the saloon and store. Hondo looked around slowly. A card game was going on at the other end of the room. Buffalo was sitting in, and Hondo recognized the man with whom he had had troubles at headquarters. There was another character of whom he had seen a good deal, not only here, but at the pass over in Texas. A sour-faced man with a snaky look to his eyes and a habit of winning in poker games no matter how. The last of them was Pete Somerville. Pete was 17, a hard-riding youngster, cocky, overconfident. Now, he was not quite drunk, but nearing it. Obviously, he was in no condition to play poker, and obviously the gambler was encouraging him to drink. Hondo tossed off his own drink and watched the game. The man with whom he had trouble earlier seemed adept with the cards. Hondo put down his glass, drew the back of his hand across his mouth, and walked over to the table. Ed Lowe looked up when Hondo stopped by the table, and something in him tightened. 3 6s and 2 pretty 4s, he said, spreading his cards. "I win. Let's go again." Pete looked up and grinned. "Hi, Hondo. Broke my heart when I heard you made it." "Your pa know when you started going against that so-called whiskey, Pete." Pete grinned. The whiskey was already having its effect. "Ain't seen him for a month." Hondo dropped his hand to his shoulder. "I know you haven't, and I've got a message from him for you. Come on." Pete got to his feet, staggering a little. "Sure, Hondo." "Come down to the bar where we can talk. These gents'll excuse you." "I won't." The words were low spoken, but Hondo heard them clearly. He turned. It was the man with whom he'd had trouble earlier. "I'm out almost 100 simoleons." "That I can figure," Hondo replied mildly. "With Buffalo in the game, come along, Pete." Lowe came to his feet quickly and caught Hondo by the shirt front. "Wait a minute." Hondo looked at the hand gripping his shirt, then lifted his cold eyes to Lowe's. "I just bought that shirt," he said mildly. The other men were on their feet too. Hondo pushed Pete out of range as Lowe started a punch. It was the wrong thing for Lowe to do. As the punch started, Hondo's left hand came up and knocked the grip loose from his shirt, and he stepped inside of the looping left with a lifting right uppercut to the chin. Lowe staggered, and instantly Hondo swung a right that knocked Buffalo into a corner. Lowe had gone down hard, but as Buffalo sat up, Lowe gathered himself. "What'd you hit me for?" Buffalo demanded in pained surprise. "Because you're the most dangerous." Hondo had started to turn away when Lowe went for his gun. "Not in the back," Buffalo shouted. "Leather it." Turning swiftly, Hondo kicked the gun from Lowe's hand, and then he grabbed him by the shirt front and jerked him to his feet. Hondo smashed a right into Lowe's stomach, then shoved him away and hit him in the face with both hands. Lowe lunged, swinging, but Hondo knocked down Lowe's right and crossed over his left. Lowe staggered, and Hondo walked in, his face expressionless. He hit Lowe with a left to the body, then a right. Lowe backed up, not liking it, and Hondo slapped him. It was a powerful, brutal slap that jarred Lowe to his heels and turned him half around. Then Hondo dropped him with a straight right. Lowe sprawled on the floor, and Hondo picked him up by the scruff of the neck and the seat of the pants, and when somebody opened the door, he heaved him out into the dirt. Lowe landed on his face in the gravel, and Hondo waited an instant in the door. Ed Lowe rolled over. His body was alive with vindictive hatred, and he stared up at Hondo. "You ain't heard the last of this," he said thickly. "Then I'll keep listening," Hondo said, turning back into the saloon. The door closed and Ed Lowe remained on the ground, staring at the blackness. The two men seated outside had not moved. One's cigarette glowed red. Lowe gathered himself and got shakily to his feet. He spat blood from a cut lip. His head felt foggy, and there was a raw pain in his side. "I'll kill him," he said into the night. "I'll kill him for this." The cigarette glowed briefly. "I was you," the voice said mildly. "I'd figure I was lucky he wasn't packing a gun." That's Hondo Lane. Inside, Hondo walked over to Buffalo, put his hand on the big man's shoulder. "Sorry, friend. I didn't know who all that was in the shindig, and I figured I wanted no part of you in a brawl." Buffalo chuckled. "All right, I was wishing the kid was out of it. Ed and that sidewinder from the past roped him in." Hondo jerked his head toward the door. "This is the second time I've tangled with that mouthy no good. Who is he, anyhow?" "Calls himself Lowe. Ed Lowe." Ed Lowe. Hondo looked at the glass on the bar. Angie's husband, and alive. What kind of man would leave a woman and child alone at such a time as this? And he had been lifting the roof at headquarters about his cattle. Nothing said about his wife and child. When F Company rode out of the post at daylight, Hondo Lane was standing by to watch them go. With them was riding a company of scouts commanded by Lieutenant Crawford. These were a mixture of Apaches, Yaquis, Opatas, and Mexicans, with a scattering of Americans. All were skilled Indian fighters. It was a strong force for a burial detachment, but their orders were explicit. They were under no concern to attempt to follow Vittorio or to engage in any battle unless first attacked. Hondo watched them go, his face somber. There was small chance they would encounter Vittorio, although the company of scouts carried enough wild country brains to have found him no matter where he fled, if they had been permitted. The orders of Major Sherry had been definite, however, and he did not intend to overstep them unless the situation was drastic. To send good men after those who had died with Company C would be worse than foolish. When Crook was present in force, it would be a different story. Hondo watched them ride out, then walked back to the jacal and began mending gear. He was thinking of Angie. It was no business of his. She had a husband, but she should not be out there alone. Restlessly, he went to the corral and curried the surprised line back, then fed him a couple of carrots he found in a garden patch near the end of the village. Buffalo wandered over and joined him. "Don't you be careless, Hondo," he advised. "That Lowe ain't liable to forget what you handed him last night." "I won't forget." He worked over the horse a little longer, then released him with a slap on the shoulder. As he watched the line back cross the corral, he asked, "Lowe been around long?" "Month, maybe more. Plays a little poker." Buffalo bit off a chew of tobacco. "Hangs out with that rattler Fallinger." All day reports came in of moving Indians. 20 Chiricahuas had left the reservation, all young bucks. Some Tontos had been seen crossing the Francisco River heading south. There was a gathering of the tribes. Twice groups of settlers came into the post, worn and tired from travel, and found shelter in the abandoned tents of a departed army unit. Each time Hondo made inquiries among them, but they had come in from farther south, and there was no report of anyone in the basin country. Restlessly, he awaited the return of the burial detail. They had no orders to go beyond the scene of the massacre, but the scouts would be riding over more country, and they might have some information. It was unnaturally quiet at the post. There was no roistering or loud talk around the bar in the sutler's store. Men came and went hurriedly, and the mounted patrols that left the post moved in and out like clockwork. The last patrol in before dark reported a running battle with a handful of Indians in which one Indian was slain and a trooper wounded. As the hours passed, tension grew. It was noon a day later before the burial detail rode in. No Indians had been seen, although they had cut the trails of several small groups. Shortly after the burial detail returned, Hondo Lane walked into the headquarters building. The sergeant looked up as he entered. "Major Sherry in?" "He's in. Just a minute." The sergeant returned. "Go on in. He wanted to see you anyway." Sherry was leaning back in his chair looking out the window at the heat-baked parade ground. He was a grim-faced, clean-cut man of 44, a professional soldier who knew the frontier and liked it. He knew the country, the Indians, and the men he commanded. Years of duty in the face of the enemy had burned away all the spit and polish. He was a fighting man and wanted to be nothing else. He had been close to the top of his class at the point, but he'd never cared for Eastern duty. He knew the book on combat tactics, but most of what he knew had been learned by applying it in battle against enemies that could be counted the greatest guerrilla tacticians the world had ever known. "What's on your mind, Lane?" "I want to go out there." Lane jerked his head toward the hills. "Personal business." Sherry turned to his desk and shuffled his papers. "Sorry, Lane, it can't be done. The general wants you here for the time being." He stacked the papers. "Personal business, you said?" "Yes, sir. There's a woman out there with a child. They wouldn't come in then. They might come now." The major took out his pipe and stoked it with tobacco. "You lived with the Apaches, that right?" "Yes, sir." Major Sherry touched a match to the pipe. "I've been ordered to hold all scouts in. The general has something in mind. Nevertheless, I'd like, and I know he'd like, some information on Vittorio. If anybody could get it, you could." Hondo Lane shifted in his chair, waiting. The major's face did not change. "It's mighty dangerous out there. Any man who went out alone would be a fool. And we've orders to stop anyone at all." Hondo Lane got to his feet and turned to the door. "That all, sir?" "Yes." Major Sherry drew on his pipe and looked out the window. As Hondo pulled on his hat and opened the door, Sherry turned his face toward him. "Lane," he said quietly, "be careful." And that was chapter 8 of the book Hondo by Louis L'Amour. Back in a minute. Thank you. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all of the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, and reminding you to listen to the John and Ken Show on KFI AM 640, Monday through Friday from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific Time. Also, KFI needs to bring back bryan-suits and his show, The Dark Secret Place. Hashtag bring back bryan-suits. Until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.